I am Dr. Márcio Pereira, a neuroscientist, and I dedicate my work to studying how the human brain constructs emotions, bonds, and behavioral patterns that we rarely consciously perceive. Today, I want to talk about something that seems simple at first glance, but which hides one of the deepest conflicts of the human mind. Why do you cling to someone who doesn't value you? At first glance, the answer usually comes readily, almost automatically. People say it's love. They say it's hope. They say they believe in the other person's ability to change, that they see potential where no one else does, that they don't give up easily. This explanation is socially accepted, even romanticized. In films, songs, and stories, persistent attachment is often portrayed as proof of emotional depth, loyalty, and sensitivity. The narrative is simple: those who love persist. But this explanation, while comforting, is superficial. It ignores something essential about how the human brain works. Most emotional decisions don't originate from consciousness, but from primitive circuits shaped long before we learn to name feelings. What we call love is often just the label we give to a set of neurobiological reactions that operate below the level of reason. When someone clings to someone who doesn't value them, what's at stake is rarely affection itself. What's at stake is a poorly calibrated reward system, an old emotional memory, and a silent attempt by the brain to resolve something left incomplete in the past. The human brain doesn't seek happiness. That's a modern myth. The brain seeks predictability. It seeks known patterns. It seeks to reduce uncertainty. And paradoxically, it prefers familiar suffering to unknown well-being. That which is emotionally chaotic, but recognizable, is perceived as safer than that which is healthy, but new. This is where the first mistake begins. Many people believe they become attached because they feel too much. In reality, they become attached because the brain's threat system is activated. When someone demonstrates affection in an unstable way, sometimes present, sometimes distant, the brain releases dopamine irregularly. And dopamine, contrary to popular belief, is not the pleasure hormone, but the hormone of anticipation. It doesn't reward what one has, but what could become. This intermittent pattern creates a cycle similar to addiction. Absence generates anxiety. The slightest crumb of attention generates relief. Relief reinforces the behavior. And the brain learns silently that it needs to stay there to feel that brief sensation of connection again. It's not love, it's conditioning. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational evaluation, decision-making, and self-perception, begins to lose ground to the limbic system, which governs fear, attachment, and emotional survival. The person starts to justify behaviors that, under any other circumstances, would seem unacceptable. They minimize the disdain, rationalize the absence, and interpret the indifference as an emotional difficulty on the part of the other person. And at that point, something even more profound happens. The brain begins to confuse value with effort. The harder it is to be loved, the more valuable the love seems. This is a classic, yet extremely powerful cognitive error. It stems from the unconscious idea that if something requires sacrifice, then it must be worthwhile. Suffering then comes to be interpreted as proof of emotional investment, not as a warning sign. Society reinforces this mechanism all the time. From an early age, we learn that relationships require struggle, that loving means enduring, that giving up is a sign of weakness. Little is said about the psychological cost of remaining where there is no reciprocity. Little is said about how this type of attachment slowly erodes self-esteem, distorts the perception of personal value, and creates a silent emotional dependence. What's most unsettling is that in many cases, the attachment isn't directed at the person themselves, but at the feeling they evoke. An old feeling, familiar, sometimes linked to childhood, to how affection was received or denied in early relationships. The brain then begins to seek in the present the resolution of a wound that originated in the past. And this is exactly where the trap closes. Because the more a person tries to be seen, recognized, or chosen by someone who doesn't value them, the more they reinforce the unconscious belief that they need to strive to deserve love. And this belief, once established, shapes choices, relationships, and expectations throughout life. But if that's true, an uncomfortable question arises, one that is rarely asked aloud. and which begins to destabilize the comfortable narrative we tell ourselves. Do you cling to someone who doesn't value you because you love them too much? Or because, at some deep level, you still believe you need to prove that you deserve to be loved? When we observe more closely the behavior of those who cling to people who don't reciprocate, something begins to become evident. It's not just a misguided emotional choice, but a silent learning process that the brain has incorporated over time. A learning process that has rarely been questioned, because it was built even before the person had the language to describe it. The human brain is shaped by repetition. It learns not from what is said, but from what is experienced consistently. If, in early relationships, affection was accompanied by instability, emotional distance, excessive demands, or unpredictability, the nervous system began to associate love with tension. Not as a rational concept, but as a bodily sensation, a familiar internal state. That's why later on, calm and stable relationships can seem boring, empty, or artificial. The brain doesn't recognize in them the pattern it learned to call a bond. Instead of security, it feels estrangement. Instead of peace, restlessness. The body doesn't react. Dopamine doesn't surge. There isn't that emotional fluctuation that, in the past, was mistaken for intensity. And then a disturbing phenomenon emerges. The person begins to confuse tranquility with disinterest and instability with passion. From a neurological standpoint, this makes sense. A brain that has grown up in emotionally unpredictable environments develops a hypersensitivity to rejection. It becomes highly vigilant to signs of distancing, silence, or a change in tone. Small gestures take on exaggerated weight. An unanswered message activates the same brain circuits linked to physical threat. The body goes into a state of alert. In this state, the nervous system doesn't seek well-being. It seeks relief. And any minimal gesture from the other person, a response, a compliment, a vague promise, acts as a momentary release of dopamine and relief from anxiety. The brain learns quickly. Persistence works, at least for a few moments. This cycle is powerful because it is self-reinforcing. The more a person invests, the harder it becomes to pull back. Not just emotionally, but neurologically. The brain hates the idea of loss. It prefers to reinterpret reality rather than admit that it invested energy, time, and expectation in something that will not return. This is where silent rationalizations emerge. He's just confused. She's afraid to get involved. If I'm more patient, she'll change. It's not the right time. These phrases are not conscious lies. They are attempts by the brain to protect its own identity. Admitting that the other person doesn't value you implies accepting something far more painful, that you remained where there was no reciprocity for reasons that have nothing to do with love. And then the central conflict arises. On one hand, there is the desire to be seen, chosen, recognized. On the other, there is a deep fear of abandonment, rejection, and loneliness. Between these two poles, the brain creates an illusory solution: to remain, to wait, to try again, to adjust, to diminish oneself, to silence needs, to justify absences. Gradually, the person stops realizing that they are negotiating with themselves, that they are giving up boundaries, values, and emotional dignity in exchange for small doses of validation. What is most disturbing is that the more this happens, the more distant the ability to recognize one's own worth outside of that relationship becomes. At this stage, the attachment is no longer about the other person. It's about identity. People don't just fear losing someone. They fear losing the narrative they've constructed to make sense of their own pain. Because if that relationship had no value, then all the effort, all the waiting, all the hope were in vain. And that's a conclusion the brain resists with all its might. Society, in turn, subtly reinforces this trap. It exalts persistence, romanticizes sacrifice, and transforms emotional suffering into proof of depth. Little is said about the silent violence of remaining unseen. Little is said about the neurological cost of living in a constant state of expectation and frustration. Over time, this pattern leaves its mark. Self-esteem becomes fragile. The fear of loss increases. The ability to trust oneself diminishes, and the person begins to confuse attachment with identity, pain with love, anxiety with connection. But perhaps the most unsettling question isn't why you cling to someone who doesn't value you. Perhaps the real question is another one, much more difficult to face. What inside have you learned that makes you think love needs to hurt to be real? To understand why this pattern persists even when the pain becomes evident, it is necessary to observe an internal conflict that rarely reaches consciousness. The silent struggle between the system that seeks connection and the system that seeks self-preservation. The human brain wasn't designed for modern happiness. It was shaped to ensure survival in hostile environments. And in that context, being connected to someone, even imperfectly, was always safer than being alone. Isolation for the primitive brain meant death. This trait remains active, even in a society where loneliness no longer represents an immediate physical threat. That's why, when a relationship begins to crumble, the nervous system reacts as if it were facing real danger. The heart races, thoughts become fragmented, anxiety grows, the body goes into a state of alert. The mind doesn't seek clarity, it seeks reconnection. Anything that reestablishes the bond, even momentarily, is interpreted as relief. At this point, something crucial happens. Reason loses its power. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for assessing risks, setting limits, and projecting consequences, is gradually silenced by the constant activation of the limbic system. Intense emotions hijack logic. The person comes to know, rationally, that the relationship is unbalanced, but is unable to act in accordance with that knowledge. This is one of the cruelest aspects of dysfunctional attachment. It creates an internal split. The person understands but can't get out. They see the signs but minimize them. They recognize the pattern but feel they don't have the strength to break it. And then guilt arises, which further deepens the cycle. If I know this is hurting me, why do I continue? Why can't I leave? What's wrong with me? These questions, repeated silently, erode self-esteem. The individual begins to perceive themselves as weak, dependent, or emotionally flawed, when in reality they are trapped in a profoundly human neuropsychological mechanism. There is another, even more delicate factor in this process. Attachment to someone who doesn't value you often triggers an unconscious attempt at reparation. The brain tries in the present to heal an old wound. It believes that if it finally manages to be chosen now, something from the past will also be healed. That's why certain patterns repeat themselves with striking precision. Different people, different stories, but the same feeling of not being enough, the same effort to please, the same hope that, this time, it will be different. What changes is not the script, only the characters. The mind creates a narrative in which love needs to be earned. And, within this narrative, suffering ceases to be a warning sign and begins to be interpreted as part of the process. Pain becomes normalized. Absence is justified. Neglect is rationalized. Meanwhile, the body records everything. Studies in effective neuroscience show that relationships marked by insecurity continuously activate the stress axis. Elevated cortisol, constant tension, emotional hypervigilance. Over time, this affects sleep, concentration, the immune system, and even the perception of personal worth. The person begins to live in a state of waiting for a message, a change, a confirmation. To live like this is to live in suspension. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect is this. The longer someone remains in this type of relationship, the harder it becomes to imagine another way of loving. Pain becomes the standard. Anxiety becomes familiar. Instability transforms into emotional identity. At this point, it's no longer just about the other person. It's about who the person believes themselves to be within a relationship. And then a question arises that few dare to ask because it threatens to dismantle the entire internal structure that sustains attachment. If the love you seek requires you to diminish yourself, to be silent, or to constantly adapt, is that still love, or just fear of being alone? There's a moment, almost always silent, when something begins to change. It's not a dramatic break, nor a clear decision. It's a diffuse feeling, difficult to name, a weariness that doesn't go away, an uncomfortable perception that Despite all the effort, nothing really transforms. It is at this point that the brain, exhausted from sustaining the dissonance, begins to allow a question that was previously avoided. What if the problem isn't a lack of love from the other person, but the way I learned to love? This question doesn't arise as liberation. It arises as a threat, because it demands that the individual abandon the narrative that has sustained their choices for so long. It demands that they look at their own role in the cycle, not to blame themselves, but to recognize a pattern that was operating behind the scenes. When this happens, something fundamental is revealed. Attachment to someone who doesn't value you is rarely about the other person. It's about the difficulty of sustaining one's own emotional existence without depending on external validation. It's about the often unconscious belief that one is only worthy when someone confirms it. Over time, the brain begins to associate personal value with the responses of others. A look, a message, a minimal gesture become indicators of identity. When these are lacking, emptiness arises. And emptiness is intolerable for a mind that has learned to exist only in relation to others. That's why the idea of leaving is more frightening than staying. Because leaving demands something that has never been fully developed: emotional autonomy. It demands upholding one's own worth without applause, without validation, without the presence of someone to confirm one's existence. From a neurological point of view, this represents a profound restructuring. It means teaching the brain that security doesn't come from others, but from one's own capacity for self-regulation. That silence is not abandonment. That absence is not rejection. That solitude is not failure, but a space where something can finally reorganize itself. But this process is not immediate. The brain resists. It tries to return to the familiar. It produces nostalgia, idealization, selective memories. It erases what hurt and amplifies what comforted, all to keep the bond alive, even if only in memory. It is at this stage that many people confuse pain with love again. They feel the absence. They interpret the absence as proof of feeling. They don't realize that what they feel is often just the echo of a nervous system that hasn't yet learned to function without constant emotional stimulation. Society offers little help at this time. It teaches us to quickly seek another relationship, another distraction, another object of affection. It rarely teaches us to remain with ourselves. It rarely teaches us to cross the void without hastily filling it. But it is precisely in this void that something essential can emerge. When a person begins to tolerate absence without self-annihilation, something changes in their internal structure. The brain slowly begins to recalibrate its criteria for attachment. The body learns that it is possible to exist without constant tension. The mind begins to distinguish between excitement and connection, anxiety and affection, attachment and love. And then, for the first time, a disconcerting realization emerges. Perhaps you never became attached to the other person. Perhaps she clung to the hope that, through him, she would finally feel sufficient. This realization doesn't bring immediate relief. It brings silence. A dense, almost uncomfortable silence. But it is in this silence that the cycle begins to unravel. Not because someone explained it, but because something, internally, ceased to sustain the illusion. And then there remains the final question, the one that doesn't demand a quick answer, nor a comfortable conclusion, but which resonates powerfully precisely because it cannot be ignored. If you didn't have to prove anything to anyone, would you still choose to remain where you're not seen?